Thank you very much. And now the floor to Angela Melo, and who is Director of the Ethical Division of Sports and Youth at the UNESCO. So we find that with the development of online gaming, particularly of sports betting online, an international response is required for all the problems that seem to have arisen. So what does UNESCO intend doing about this? Well, once again, let's say hello to everyone once again. And I'd also like to thank the presence of the Minister, because I heard that France is working very hard with a view to ratifying the legislation at the Council of Europe for all sports manipulation and machinations. And saying this, I'd like to thank Mr. Poloni for his invitation over here to come and speak to you at this roundtable, which is based on integrity of gaming. Now, we in UNESCO, we don't have any particular skills in this particular field, but we do have the scope to do so. It is very much within our scope to talk about it. All the roundtables that I've participated in over here tend to actually increase the value of sport. And now, before answering your question directly, I have two questions that I'd like to ask you. And firstly, is the solution proposed by UNESCO in terms of international efforts in this field? And secondly, is to tell you about the all the work that UNESCO is doing in sports. Also, we will talk about international rules regarding manipulation of sports and sports activities. And then finally, I'll answer your question. So as far as the role of UNESCO is concerned in sports, our roadmap in terms of sports policy as established by UNESCO is amongst the is a conference of sports ministers. These days we have organized 5 MINEPs. It's these sports conferences, and they play an extremely important role. The MINEPs number 1 gave UNESCO the mandate to develop an international charter for physical education and activities, sports. Now, this charter was adopted in 1978. It was revised occasionally, and now it's going to be revised by the General Conference that will take place in November. So this charter, which takes into account all measures that are taken, and any sports minister can bring in any article to implement this mechanism in his or her own country. Now, for instance, the charter, the longest article is article number 10 that talks about saving and promoting in integrity the ethical values of physical education and sports. And under this article, you have all the provisions and the requests, the requirements that the charter makes of its member states. Now, MINEPS 1 also created an intergovernmental committee in sports, and which is made up of 18 UNESCO members and who are all experts in physical education and sports. Its essential aim is to promote sports value and include them in the sports policy. It is also an operational mechanism in sports within UNESCO. Now, MINEPS number 2. It wasn't all that down to earth, because it took place against the background of Cold War. So all that was requested of member states was to increase cooperation, and it also launched a reflection on doping amongst the youth. So it didn't really have a major impact as such, or results, as the MINEPS 1 did. Now, MINEPS 3 and 4, MINEPS 3 took place in Uruguay in 1999, in Punta del Este, and the next one in 2004 in Athens. And this time, states decided to ask UNESCO to draw up a law against doping. So we came up with an international convention against doping in sports in 2005. And this particular legislation is widespread. Now, MINUPS number 5 is very well known. It's very well known in the sports background, because there was the Berlin Declaration, where there was a commitment that we call a commission on the preservation of sports events and all that UNESCO members should do to fight any kind of sports manipulation and machinations. So these are the three frameworks, either normative or political, in which UNESCO implements its activities. This brings me to point number 2, and this is international regulation for fighting manipulation of sports competitions. Now, I'd like to point out to you what exactly is this law on manipulation. Now, I work at a regional level and not really at an international level, but I'll explain why. In other words, the convention, the Council of Europe on fighting manipulation of sports events, defines exactly what this sort of act is. But in a wider definition that you see up over here, in terms of preparatory work, they took a close look at the kind of manipulative acts. Now, what the minister here just said was extremely important, because if there have to be sanctions, there has to be a clear idea about what exactly we are talking and what action is being punished. That's extremely important from the point of view of the law. So you have a list where you determine everything, a list, in fact, of such acts, so that people know exactly what we're talking about. Let me take you down to the second point about these international and national rules when it comes to manipulation of sports events, and what do we find? The first point that we find is that there's a total absence of international regulation in this field. There is just a framework, and that is about manipulation of sports events. There are regional regulations, because you talk only about Europe. So you've got the Council of Europe, which has adopted this convention, regional convention for fighting sports events manipulation. Why do I put it at a regional level? Because despite the fact that this convention has an international dimension to it and an international scope to it, because it says that this convention is open to ratification by all members, but given the nature of the Council of Europe, you can't really go beyond a regional framework. However, this shows a lot of progress, because we have done all that, we've got all that it takes to make it a more harmonized measure. And since we are talking of manipulation, sports bets are also being covered, will probably also be covered. So maybe these means will also be taken to fight all kinds of illegal betting, illicit betting, and frauds, as far as online betting is concerned. Now, the third point is that there is absolutely no heterogeneity in terms of legislation at a national level either. We heard what France had to say, which has its own legislation, but so far it hasn't opened up, for instance, sports betting to the competition. But on the other side, you've got Belgium and the rest of the European area, where there's no homogeneity. Plus, my question is there any kind of coordination, harmonization? Is there some sort of consistent policy to fight manipulation in this field? I'm talking about swindling, I'm talking about dishonesty, and I'm talking about all that goes on in this field, as illicit gambling. Now, even though we don't have any kind of international measures or laws, certain actions, certain acts are regulated internationally. because they might stain the reputation of sports in general. I'm talking of doping which can very seriously dishonor sports. Now, as you know, UNESCO represents ethics in all fields. So anything that goes against morality and ethics becomes an issue for UNESCO, and doping is something that UNESCO has decided to fight. So in the framework of an international regulation, so that's why we have this international convention, and it has been ratified so far by 152 countries. It is the second most ratified convention. Now, this convention has a follow-up system as well to it. There's also a system of self-evaluation, a self-assessment carried out by the states themselves. And each time there's this conference of parties, they meet and they give a report on how far they have gotten. So we are, besides organizing this this conference of parties, so there'll be 2 days of discussion on the anti-doping measures. It's also important to note that this convention requires member states to apply the anti-doping code as adopted by the AMA, that's the International Anti-Doping Agency. So it's required of member states to report, on how far they've gotten with their activities in fighting doping. Nationally, countries are supposed to transpose all these provisions of the AMA code and try and well, normally what happens is that the states do try and to fight doping. However, they're still at a very primary stage because they are assessing what was already being implemented by member states to see what effect it has had. Anyway, our meeting starts tomorrow and we will see what is to be said and what will be done. Now, briefly, I'd like to talk to you about manipulation in sports events, because this entire law covers corruption, as you mentioned, and all kinds of international crime organized in sports. So you have the international normative framework of the UNESCO that was adopted in 2004 to fight corruption and organized crime. This is very general as well, but that is one of the methods that we have to fight the scourge. Now, paradoxically, because I heard that Singapore has a very strong network, a very powerful network of sports manipulation and so on. We also heard that Singapore has a very strong legislation against all sorts of manipulation. So that's a paradox, but that's the way things are. And on the one hand, you regulate, and on the other hand, you've got those who are breaching the law, violating the law. So now this brings me to my last question, which you had asked me. I'll be extremely brief because I'll read it out to you. Firstly, UNESCO backs this Convention of the Council of Europe on sports manipulations, and there should be certain awareness measures that should be undertaken, particularly for those who take decisions at a political level, at the highest level, therefore, and at the same time there has to be a concerted action taken by all stakeholders, because I see that we're all present over here. We are working, but we must try and move together, and that there be a sort of united movement to fight this sort of manipulation. Thirdly, we must identify principles, international principles and standards, for instance, all the good practices, the right tools, and finally, I think we must have a general idea of what's happening, try and understand what the drawbacks are, the weaknesses are, and find the right solution. Fourthly, the fourth proposal would be to strengthen the existing mechanism. Firstly, UNESCO is working with the Council of Europe and the UN on prevention, exchange, and dialogue. As far as information exchange is concerned, for legal experts and others who work in this field, there is a problem of of private data, and that's where a problem that has to be respected. We are also working with the Council of Europe and the University of Sorbonne, working on a manual on this exchange of information. So maybe that would be some sort of a solution. This is being funded by the International Center on Sports Safety and Security. So this international cooperation must be extended at all levels, regional, national, in all directions virtually, both within the private and the public sector. Fifth proposal, we need to take a look at vital plan. In other words, we must have a secure framework to provide an alert warning system, provide the right data for the international, regional, and national organizations. That doesn't really exist. Mr. Minar, it doesn't really exist. Apart from that, there's no good management of all this data and information that we receive. How do we process it, if at all we do? And finally, let me be a little provocative, and I'm not sure if my colleagues at UNESCO would be happy to hear me. Some would be happy and some wouldn't be. But I think we need to go further. We must think about sports governance as such. We shouldn't work in bits and pieces. We should try and make it an organized movement, better managed, smooth and seamless. Now, of course, we shall maintain certain principles, but there's also that of complementarity, and that is that when we can, we should work together, hand in hand. We have to go beyond what we're doing, because if not, I don't know how we would save integrity in sport. Thank you very much for your attention.